2360 students. So this module 3 is really looking at the differences and likenesses among children. And what we're talking about is we're specifically looking at a child's development, and we're going to assess to see is there possibility, there's a disability, or is it a developmental delay. So really we're going to hone in and looking at, well, what are the risk factors that contribute to developmental delay? Also the causes of disabilities. This is also where you're going to begin your case study work. Now, I've had several students email me their child of choice for the case study project. So if you haven't done that, please let me know who you choose to do your presentation on. Remember, you will use the same child for all the projects for the case study. So when we're looking at IDEA and we're looking at disabilities under IDEA, we have to look at the 3 categories when we talk about them. We talk about sensory, physical health, and then learning behavioral. And the reason that we're really looking closely at those is because that's going to help us to understand the disabilities and how we categorize them. Now, you will be having to look at your textbook and read some chapters, as well as really looking at the resources available to you in the 2 sections or lessons in Module 3. So one of the things I want to kind of bring to your attention, in addition to the Module 3 quiz, you're also going to be submitting that case study PowerPoint, which is what we talked about, which I will go into depth in that. But that's the overview of what you're going to be working on. Now remember, each module is 2 weeks long, so you do have 2 weeks to complete the lessons and read the chapters, and to work on that first assignment for your case study project. So when we're looking at Module 3, we're really focusing on, like I said, the likenesses and differences. But we also need to turn and look at not only the key questions to help guide your study, but we're also looking at our objectives. So what are you going to be able to do after this module? I listed them here. These objectives are really going to connect and help us achieve our course outcomes. So 2 of the course outcomes that we will be able to achieve through this module is to identify recommended practices and elements for inclusive early childhood programs, as well as understand the causes, classifications, and characteristics of developmental disabilities. So some of the things that we're going to be able to look at is really looking at the different categories of children. We've got typical, atypical, developmental delayed, at-risk, gifted. We're also going to be looking at what would be some of those causes of developmental disabilities. And with that, we're also going to look specifically IDA and the federal educational categories of those disability conditions, which is what you will be doing with research for your case study child. So when we're talking about some of these questions listed here, we're really looking at two different things, right? So we're looking at typical and atypical development, but we're also going to look at the categories, right? So diving deeper into sensory and then physical health and then learning behavioral disabilities. And the reason that we split those 2 up is because it's such a heavy content when we're talking about atypical versus typical and then looking at the 3 categories as well. So really these questions should help guide your focus. That's why I put them in the beginning with the course overview and objective, because with the research and completing the modules, it's helping you engage deeper with the materials, right? So they're going to help you gain a better understanding and nuances when we're talking about developmental disabilities and what kind of impact are they going to have on your early childhood classroom. So something that I also want you to look at is what you will be reading, and I wanted to kind of point out some things in our textbook chapters that's going to help you that I really want you to focus on. So as you see here, you have 4 chapters. 5 chapters, but as these chapters are not very long, but one thing I want you to look at is when you're doing this to split the reading up, because it can be a lot. But the reason I gave these chapters is because with this module, there's a lot of content. So something that I want you to pay attention when we're looking at chapter 4 is going back to that typical, atypical. So chapter 4 is really good because it lets you look at what is normal and exceptional development, right? Which is, again, going back to that connection of typical and atypical. Specifically looking at section 4.1, which starts on page 87 in your textbook. I also want you to look at section 4.3 in chapter 4 in your textbook, which starts on page 95, where it talks about children who are at developmental risk. Okay. I feel like that's important. And like I said, these chapters are very short, so I feel like it's okay that even though there's a lot, it's doable for 2 weeks in this module. Chapter 5 is really going into more of the causes and classifications when we're talking about disabilities. It really does go in deep as far as how the fetus is developed and some things that could occur that would cause those biological factors. But it really gets into talking about other things that might cause disabilities, prenatal infections and toxins and complications during birth. And so there's lots of things that go into it. But one section I felt like was important to focus on is really the classification, right? Because we said in this module, we're really looking at IDEA regulations and what are the specific disability terms under the IDEA regulations. So that starts in section 5.2 on page 116. That will go quite a bit, pretty much most of the chapter. Make sure that you look and hone in on that because there will be some questions on the quiz from that section. And then chapter 6 is really going into more specifics, such as sensory impairments like hearing and vision. So within those, it explains different signs that you might have, possible signs for children, which starts on page 131, which I felt like was useful. And also some early intervention guidelines for teachers to follow on page 134. So that would be something for, I feel like, for you to look at. Now, in terms of vision, it goes into depth as far as the physical aspect of what happens. But what I would like us to focus on too as well is that how do you teach children who have vision loss, and what are the guidelines for you as an early childhood educator in an inclusive classroom? So there's really a great section on page 145 through 147 that I'd like you to look at. Okay, so chapter 7 is talking about physical disabilities and health problems. This whole chapter really we need to focus on because the physical disabilities under IDEA lists quite a few. But what I want you to see is all the different types maybe I said you wouldn't even be aware of what they are. So really this whole chapter I want you to kind of focus on. But one thing also to mention is on page 161, it starts talking about universal design for learning. So I really want you to look at that as well. And lastly, chapter 8. Chapter 7 will probably be the one that's a little heavier, but the rest of the chapters are not very long. It goes specifically talking about behavior disorders and learning disorders. So the thing I need you to focus on is in section 8.2 on page 192, where it talks about the different learning disabilities, right? So not only are we defining them, but we're also looking at what are those risk indicators that we need to be paying attention to. And then on section 8.2c, learning about response to intervention, RTI, and what role that plays in when we're talking about behavior. Remember, when we're talking about the RTI, most of the time we're talking about those 3 tiers for K-12 schools. But when we're looking at this model specifically for pre-K RTI that we are looking at, and that the model is on page 200 that I want you to focus on as well. So, and there are some great resources here that I listed for you underneath the textbook. So just make sure you get a chance to look at those. So as I mentioned, you will have two lessons, 3.1 and 3.2. 3.1 is really looking at the causes and classifications, right? So what is your role? What's atypical versus typical? What are some causes? How do we classify or define these things? And then also a separate section on young children who are gifted and talented. And then in lesson 3.2, we're really focusing more on categorizing, like I talked about. So sensory, and then physical or health, and then we go into learning and behavior. So we're categorizing the disabilities at that point. So at the bottom, you're going to see your activities and assessments and how you're going to be graded. So you will have your Module 3 quiz. Again, it will stay open for 2 weeks. So it'll start Monday, February 10th, and it closes February the 23rd. So you do have 2 weeks. I suggest at least going through a week and reading all the chapters before you feel like you would be prepared enough to take the quiz. But you can have multiple attempts to take the quiz to get the highest grade. And then I also put some resources down here for you to go along with your case study work. So we're going to jump on into that because this module is when you start your case study work with the child that you chose. So on this assignment specifically, you're going to be creating what we call a PowerPoint presentation on the child's specific disability. So whatever child you chose has a disability. And underneath case study, so if you go to course information and select content, there is a section, a module that's called case study. And when you click on the case study project, it's going to give you the case study project itself, the rubric, as well as all of the children. So you can click through and look at each individual child's case study and then see which one you would like to use. So based on that, you would need to read the entire project, and then you would be able to look at the rubric and then choose your child. So let's say that we chose Maria. When you click on Maria, you're going to see this is her case study. It tells her demographics, where she's at now, is she in school? So right now she's in transition. It tells you her schedule, her developmental skills. It's going to tell about her progress and behavior, and then all of the notes from her observation from her teachers. So this is very important information that you're going to need to complete the case study project. Now remember, when we're looking at the case study presentation that you're developing, we're really focusing on Maria's specific disability or whatever child you choose. So the goal really is for you to deepen your understanding of the child's condition and how this is going to affect the child in the classroom. So the knowledge that you gather, right, think of it like a house. The foundation part is important, right? So you're building the foundation to help you develop plans, to help you build the rest of the house. So it's crucial that you really concentrate on the child's disability, that you understand the details, you understand what's typical, atypical. That's why you went through these 2 lessons. And really looking at how Maria will develop through the different stages later on, and how you will come up with a plan to support your case study child. So this is really the first piece. This presentation and understanding disability is that foundational piece we need. So when you use the PowerPoint presentation, you are going to be creating slides. Now, this presentation, of course, is going to require you to research. That's why I included those resources there for you in Module 3. The things that need to be included in your presentation are as follows. You need to first define the condition, right? So what's the definition? You're going to provide a clear definition of the child's disability. You also will be looking at the specific disability category under which the child will receive services according to the Tennessee State Department. So that's important for you to include that as well. Then you're going to look at assessment. How is it determined that the child qualifies for disability services? So you are going to explain that. You're also going to look at what the causes and prevalence are for this disability. You could use your textbook. You could use other resources available to you. So there's lots of different ways you can gather this information. You could use your textbook as a wonderful resource as well. The next slide is going to be your characteristics. So really outlining what is the lifespan, right, from infancy to adulthood, specifically focusing on the specific age your child is right now, okay, which all the information is under the child's case study. Then you're going to go into looking at what are the educational considerations for this child. So how will this disability affect the child in the classroom? Now, when we're looking at educational considerations, we really look at four things. We look at instructional methods and strategies, we look at environmental adaptations, social supports, and then family support and resources. So all these things have to be touched on when we're talking about educational considerations, and you will focus on these four areas underneath educational considerations. And then you lastly will have a reference page for your last slide. You will need to make sure you cite your sources, even if it's our textbook in the course, and you do need to have at least 4 resources to create this presentation. So 4 different sources to use in your research, and they have to be listed on the last page of your slide in APA format. Okay, and I'm going to show you in just a minute some wonderful resources to help you to make sure that you are able to complete the reference list in APA format. Now, I did give you some requirements for the presentation. For instance, the title slide, make sure that that's the very first thing that I see. So it includes the title of the presentation, okay, your name. So maybe you'll include your child's case study name and what disability that child has. That would be suffice for the title slide. As far as design and font, just make sure you look at accessibility, right? We don't want loud colors. We don't want it to have fonts that's hard to read. Make sure you look at headings, body text, all of that. So design should be where it is accessible for all, but also easy to read and not distracting. And that it flows, right? It makes sense. Then we're looking at images. I do want you to include images in the presentation. Images help with the content. It breaks up the content. So I need to have at least 4 slides with content images, right? And one of these images could at least be a graph or a chart related to the child's disability. Make sure that the images are relevant and connect to the content you put in that slide. Also, as I mentioned before, it does need to flow. It needs to be organized. It needs to be clear, and the content needs to make sure it's related to the information that I ask for. And then finally, make sure you edit it. Like you go back and look at it, look for errors, grammar, spelling, punctuation, those sorts of things. Now, I do have a rubric here. Now, there is underneath, and I'll show you in just a minute, when you go back to the case study project, it has a rubric for all of it, but this is specifically for this section. This project is worth 25 points. It does break down the different criteria and competencies that I'm looking for you to meet. Either does not meet, meets expectations, or exceeds. So just make sure that you look at the rubric. And one thing I did want to mention is a lot of students will look at ECED and they're like, oh, but remember, to meet it, this is what you have to do just to get confident, okay? Just to be confident in this information. To exceed, you have to do this and this, right? So you're doing exactly everything I asked for, plus you're going beyond a little bit. That's how you would get the 90 to 100%. So just make sure you look at the rubric. Now, I did mention to you that I was going to show you some resources to help you when you're developing this case study project. So one of the things first I wanted to go back and look at is where do you find the case study project? It's important for you before you begin Module 3 case study work that you actually understand the assignment. So if you go to Table of Contents, you're going to click on the case study project. And as I mentioned when I showed this to you earlier, you are going to have several things listed in here. The first one is the case study project itself. So this is what we call an overview. This is going to tell you kind of a snippet of what it's about, the 4 projects you will be involved in with your case study child. And remember, the case study child you choose will be the same one for every project you do for case study. And it has a rubric for the entire case study as well. So that's the first thing you should read. The next one is the rubric. This is the project rubric for the entire case study project, right? And it kind of breaks it down so you will see based on which project. So the first one here would be the PowerPoint presentation, then the transition plan, then we have the embedded activities, behavior support plan, and the adaptive lesson. The last one is just your reflection. So that is all included there. And then underneath, we'll have each individual case study, and you are just picking one child, and you will use that child for the entire project. If you have not done so far or haven't done so yet, please email me your case study child choice. I think I've heard from a few students, but not everyone. So please be sure to do that. Now, as far as resources, there are resources listed in Module 3, and I showed them to you earlier. If you go scroll down underneath the lessons and underneath activity assessments, you're going to see 2 resources I listed here for you. These videos were created by our Water State librarian. One of them is a video on citation help. So if you're unfamiliar with doing APA reference page or citing any kind of sources, this video is a really great resource for you. So this librarian created this for you. She also, in the video, talks about that. Will show you one of them in just a minute. So that's one resource. The other resource, she does another video, I'll show you in just a second, is talking about the different kinds of resources the library here at Water State has. So when you click on it, you'll see there's another video, and it's going to walk you through the different resources that Water State has for you. So please make sure you look at those. One of the web pages that she mentioned.
My name's Sabrina Moreland, and I'm one of the librarians at Walter State. And I'm
actually. And I'm going to show you Purdue OWL. So Purdue OWL is a web page by Purdue Online Lab, and what it does is it kind of when you're doing APA. You guys cite that. Cite that. Non-print sources, how would I cite that? What do I do for a presentation? If I'm doing APA PowerPoint slide presentation, what are the guidelines I need to follow? So this is very helpful for students who have to use APA when citing. So just make sure you look at that, and it's called Purdue OWL. And again, it is also in that video from the librarian. So that pretty much covers all of our. As always, if you need any help, or maybe you need to meet with me because you have some questions about the project, I'm able to meet with you virtually or in person. But I want to make sure that you understand what's required in this project. All right, I hope everyone has a great 2 weeks, and until next